Good morning, everyone. Today is already the seventh webinar. Actually, we do in collaboration with Pruul Meistrid, our distributor in Estonia. The webinars all are in the program of the Fermentis Academy, which is the more educational program we have at Fermentis. The idea is that we share all the knowledge that we gather from our own R&D, but also from the market, with you guys to basically help you with creating the better beers in your breweries. So, as always, first some short guidelines. The presentation today will be a bit shorter, around 30 minutes, and there's always room for questions. You can leave them for after the presentation, but if you have an urgent question, you can ask it via the chat, and then Alec can ask me, or he can give you live access by clicking some buttons. So far, that has never happened, so I think we can count on the chat function. So we are now at 7 people. There could be a bit more later or during the webinar, or some people can watch it later. So as I mentioned, it's the 7th one. Actually, last week we had some technical issues, so I couldn't manage to give the webinar. So we will do this webinar next week. So the webinar on kettle sour will be next week, November 4th. And today I will talk about Spring Blanche, actually to create and maintain a permanent haze and beer with this product, Spring Blanche. So first of all, again, a short introduction on Fermentis. So Fermentis is part of the Le Soffre group. Le Soffre is quite a big company, more than 10,000 people. It's based in Lille, the headquarters. Also, Fermentis is based in Lille, and Fermentis is the business unit that takes care of fermented beverages, basically. Our production plant is based around 40 minutes drive from Lille. It's in Ghent, and in the first webinar I showed you all about this. So I'll skip that for now. So, as I mentioned, we work for the world of fermented beverages at Fermentis: beer, wine, cider, spirits, and potable alcohol. Today I will again talk about beer, but not about yeast in this case. Today I'll talk about yeast derivatives. So at Fermentis, as I mentioned in previous webinars, we have now 15 active dry yeast, 3 lagers, and the others are ale yeast. If you want to have more information about this, how to use them, specific things like what happens if you put a yeast under different conditions, etc. You can always look back at the webinars. They have been recorded, so they will be available until early January. And we also have some nice information booklets available online. You can find that here. Take a look at it, and you will find a lot of information that I shared actually in digital format, so in writing. So next to the yeast, we also have bacteria. So this one I will talk about next week. But we also have that we call yeast derivatives. And I will talk about Spring Blanche, which is a functional product. We call it a functional product today. So what are yeast derivatives? To explain, I made this slide. A yeast derivative is basically a yeast cell component that's obtained by inactivation and autolysis of the yeast. So if you start with a yeast cream and give it a treatment, a thermal treatment, for instance, It can be done in two ways. So a strong, a high treatment, you end up with inactivated yeast cells, which you can separate to end up with a yeast protein extract, or with yeast hulls. And the yeast hulls is basically the outer membrane of the yeast cell. You can also do it more moderate, where you end up with autolyzed cells. So in the first case, you have enzyme inactivation, and in the second case, you have enzyme destabilization, which you can also separate these autolyzed cells in yeast extract, and again also the outer membranes or the hulls of the yeast. And as you can imagine, the solubility of the different fractions is different. So a protein extract is soluble in wort or in beer, while the hulls, so the outer membrane, are not very good, have a low solubility, and the reason is that the content of fat. So the outer membranes are all lipids, so a lot of fat content, so they don't or have a low solubility. So if we look at where the functional product Spring Blanche is, it's actually a yeast protein extract. So we have in Fermentis different product categories: autolyzed cells, yeast extracts, hulls, and most of these, specific products are used actually in the wine industry. So to stabilize wine and improve the quality of wine. But we are actually the first company that also is now working on functional products for beer. In this case, we have two applications now. So the Spring Blanche, which is the yeast protein extract, and also Spring Firm BR2, which is a yeast extract. And if you think about a yeast extract, it all has to do with adding nutrients to your wort. It can be specifically you add these kind of fermentation aids, as we call them, or nutrients, if you have a wort or a base that is very low in nitrogen. Because normally, if you do, for instance, a mash with a very low barley content and a lot of sugar, you might end up with too low nitrogen content, and then you need a fermentation aid to ensure that you have enough organic nitrogen available for the yeast. So Spring Blanche is a product that causes haze in beer. And let me explain a little bit more about it. Why do you need a hazing agent? So historically, it has been quite interesting, because brewers have been working really for decades to improve the colloidal stability, as they call it, of beer. So in other words, to make a beer look bright. And like maybe 10 years ago, most beers were bright beers. And a lot of research in the past has been working on, making beer stable, making the bright beer stable also over time. So if you go to the supermarket and buy a lager, it's always clear. And a lot of products that maybe you use have been developed in the past years. Products like PVPP, Brewers Clarex, all focused on making clear beer. So there were always some exceptions. More the classic ones are the German wheat beers and the Belgian style wit beers. They should be hazy. It's a desirable characteristic. And nowadays, so the past, say, like 3, 4, 5 years, you have some new beer styles, which I already handled a few webinars ago, like the New England IPA, which also should be hazy. So these were exceptions actually to, all the other beers that should be clear and bright. So if you are brewing as a craft brewer and you are trying to make these styles, we got information from the market that a lot of brewers had quite a lot of difficulty to to actually maintain the haze in the beer. So even if you make, a German style wheat beer or a Belgian style wheat beer, with a high amount of wheat in it, in the mash, sometimes they ended up being clear. In particular, if you store them for a while, a lot of brewers saw that actually all the particles in the beer were settling, and the beer was getting less and less hazy over time. So what to do? You can, if you make a great wheat beer or a great Belgian style wheat beer, you like the flavor profile, but the only thing that is missing is actually haze. So we thought about that and came up obviously with a solution. And the solution is Spring Blanche, and Spring Blanche is added to create and or maintain a desired haze, and in a natural way. Why in a natural way? Because you could add, some chemicals to create haze in the beer, but that would be considered as unnatural. So Spring Blanche, as I just showed, is a yeast protein extract, which is a natural component of yeast. So you don't have to label your beer as when you added the Spring Blanche, because it's already a natural component in yeast. So what is causing haze in beers? Just a little bit of background information. Well, basically, haze is caused by particles in suspension that scatter light. So if you dissolve, I don't know, like milk powder, for instance, in water, you see the solution becomes hazy, and the reason is that light cannot pass through. It's scattered in the glass, and that's why you see haze. So you have all kinds of particles that can cause haze. So yeast, obviously, if you are at the end of fermentation and you start bottling, sometimes you still see some haze, and that can be yeast particle, protein agglomerates, so parts of protein that's clocked together, and all kinds of other complexes. So in general, you have three types of haze, and a lot of literature is available. I strongly recommend to look in the handbook, where Professor Bamford, who was at Davis before, wrote a lot about haze. It's quite complex material, but very interesting. So you have three types: chill haze, which is reversible haze actually. So chill haze looks a bit like this. So if you brewed a clear beer and put it in the refrigerator, you see sometimes a haze is formed. This haze is caused by proteins that clock together. And if you heat up the beer again, they detach basically, and the beer becomes clear again. Not always. So reversible haze can always end up in developing permanent haze. So you should take that into account. But in general, chill haze is reversible. Then you have permanent irreversible haze, which is formed by protein polyphenol complexes. So haze active proteins, which are rich in proline in general, they originate from the barley's hordein protein fraction. So in barley, you have this specific fraction that is rich in proline, and these proteins have a very high affinity for polyphenols that originate from the barley, but also from the hops. When they form a complex, you get haze, and this is done quite easily. And then you have a third haze, which I will not discuss today. You have a haze which is non-colloidal haze caused by other substances. But where is Spring Blanche? Obviously, Spring Blanche is the second type of haze. It's the permanent haze. So as I mentioned, Spring Blanche is a yeast protein extract. It's actually very small proteins that will interact with the polyphenols that are present in the beer. The polyphenols originate from the barley malt, but also from hops. Hops also has a high polyphenol content. When they form this complex, you get a stable colloid, as it is called, and that creates a permanent haze in the beer. So these are the, if you look at these complexes, they are very, very small. And for this reason, they don't settle in your beer. So when we started this project and developed the first, say, Spring Blanche products, we checked its impact when we added it to a number of commercial available beers. And when we looked and looked at the characteristics, we considered, several cereal and malt compositions, so wheat and malt combinations. We looked at if the beers were filtrated or centrifugated. We looked at if beer was stabilized, yes or no, so stabilized with PVPP or silica gel. We looked at if the beer was pasteurized. Obviously, we also measured the polyphenol content. We looked at protein content. And we also looked at alcohol content and see if we add Spring Blanche to these different beers, if we could form a stable permanent haze. So how did we do that? So first we rehydrated the Spring Blanche in water or in beer. So again, rehydration versus direct pitching. Then we added the mix to commercial beer, and we measured the turbidity for a number of days, up to 90. Well, we are now at 120 days, but the results I'm showing today is up to 60 days. We measured the turbidity in this Huffman turbidity meter. This meter measures particle sizes, so it measures small particles, so the particles that are smaller than 1 micrometer, and these small particles like 90-degree angle. It's a bit technical, but that's what this machine does. And you find the protein polyphenol complexes. These are the ones that create a stable haze. It also measures larger particle size, such as yeast, so the particles larger than 1 micrometer. They scatter light under a different angle, 25 degrees in this case, and these create unstable haze. So when you measure at the start, you might find quite a high haziness, but as you know, when brewing beer, if it's fresh in the bottle, it can be a bit hazy, but then if you let it stand for a while, your beer can become clear. So first, the results of Spring Blanche pitched in low polyphenol blonde beers. So we tested 5 commercial beers. I obviously cannot indicate which ones they are. With this cereal composition, so in the first beer there was around 90% malt, 10% cereal, in this case wheat. The beer was filter centrifuged. It was stabilized with PVPP. It was also pasteurized. It was not bottle re-fermented. It had a polyphenol content of 59 milligram per liter. It had a protein content of 0.22 gram per 100 milliliters, ABV of 3.1, and we found a haze stability of 70%. And the haze stability is measured at a pitching of 10 gram per hectoliter Spring Blanche, and then you measure the start and the haziness at the start and the haziness after 60 days with this turbidity meter by Huffman. So we did that for all kinds of beer, and to give you an idea on what we found at different pitchings. So I'm taking now beer 2 as an example. It was a Pilsner beer, PVPP treated, Total polyphenol content was 109 milligram per liter. And as you can see, so on the x-axis you have the days, on the y-axis you have the EBC units, which are the Haze units produced by the Huffman device. It's just a measurement unit. As you can see, if you don't pitch Spring Blanche, your beer has a haziness of around 1 or even lower EBC, nice and bright. Then if you pitch the beer with 5 gram per hectoliter Spring Blanche, you develop haziness quite instantly. So already, after a day, you see that the protein from the Spring Blanche will interact with the polyphenol present in the beer and create a haze. So as you can see, the more you pitch, so the more Spring Blanche you add, the more haziness you get. And it appears that the haziness remains stable for a long period of time. So now I only have the results for 60 days, but we are already at more than 120 days where the yeast or the haziness remains stable. At somewhat higher dosing, we find that it's going down a bit, but I will show that later. So in conclusion, when you add Spring Blanche, you get haze in beer. If you increase the dose, you increase also the haziness. So how does that look visually? Again, the same beer, and this is this picture is taken 45 days after addition of Spring Blanche. So you have the control, so the start, you have clear beer, then at 5 gram per hectoliter, the Spring Blanche 10, 15, and 20, and as you can see, the haziness of the beer increases. So depending on the level of haziness that you want in your beer, you can play around with different pitching rates. So this was for blonde beer with low polyphenol content. We also looked at blonde beer with high polyphenol content, so basically more hops addition. So beer 5, 7, and 8 in this case. Some beers were bottle re-fermented, others were not. Some were pasteurized, others were not. In the end, we measured this Haze Stability, 75, 73, and 71%, so around 70% stability. Then we looked in typical Belgian style wit beers, which are known to already have some haziness, or they should have at least haziness. With a lot of more cereal or wheat actually added to it. So in this case, it's 30% for the first beer. Some are filter centrifuged, some are stabilized. What's the storage temperature of the beer? It's a room temperature. They were stored. Because at lower temperature, you create chill haze. Or you can create chill haze, so we didn't want to look into that, Radoslav. So in this case, looking at the Belgian style wit beers, we found one beer that was a bit strange. It had a high polyphenol content, but it was still remaining quite clear. So we figured out it was because of addition of Clarax. So this was a gluten-free wit beer, and Brewers Clarax is a product that you can add to beer, and Brewers Clarax will cut, basically it's a protease. It will cut all or a lot of proline-rich proteins. So the gluten are rich in proline. So Clarax cuts these, and so you end up with a gluten-free beer. But since our protein extract is also proline rich, it's also cut by Clarex. So let me show the first different pitchings of Spring Blanche. So you see, you already start at day 0 with a higher haziness in this Belgian style wit beer. But if you add different concentrations of Spring Blanche, you see again the hazy level goes up and remains quite stable over time. At higher dosing, so again at 20 gram per hectoliter, you see a little bit of a drop, but we see also in the end it remains hazy over time. So then the special case, which is the second beer, which was bottle re-fermented, and where you had the addition of Clarex, you see that despite the high polyphenol content, the Clarex is basically cutting up the proline-rich proteins, and you see that here. So you start up with quite a nice haziness, but then the haziness drops over time, and that's basically because of the action of the Clarex. So if you have if you make gluten-free beer, or if you stabilize your beer by adding Clarex, it will not work with Spring Blanche. So we observed, I showed a few slides back, the table, that some beers were re-fermented in the bottle, others were not. So we were wondering if there was any impact of yeast pitching rate during bottle re-fermentation on the development and stability of the haze. So what we did is we took some beers, we added 10 gram per hectoliter Spring Blanche, and then different concentrations of SAF ALF2, our bottle re-fermentation yeast, and again measured the haze over time with this Huffman device. We had 2 beers, a beer with a total phenol content of 109, and beer with a total polyphenol content of 124 milligram per liter. So first, beer 2 with a total polyphenol content of 109, as you can see. So at the start of bottle re-fermentation, when you add the Spring Blanche, you immediately create a lot of haze, obviously. You also create haze, and these are high levels because you add yeast. So in green, you have this concentration of yeast added. In purple, it's 10 to the 10th, 10 to the 6th. In blue, it's 20 times 10 to the 6th. And in orange, it's 50 times 10 to the 6th yeast cells per milliliter. So these are different pitching rates, basically. If you don't add anything, obviously nothing happens. So the beer remains at this current haze level. And then if you add different amounts of yeast, you see obviously at the start it's high because the yeast is dispersed in the bottle, but you see here clearly that over time the yeast will settle in the beer. So brewers that are trying to create haze with yeast, in the end will end up with a clear beer because yeast is a too big particle. So in the end, yeast will always settle. Despite a lot of you guys are working, for instance, with SAF ALU-SO5. It's a powdery yeast. It flocculates very poorly. It sediments very poorly. So you always end up with some haziness in the beer, especially in fresh beer. But if you put it away for a while, in the end also USO5 will settle. And this is a bit visualized here. You can see clearly that this is yeast settlement, but in the end you end up with some haze in the beer caused by the Spring Blanche. Then a second beer with a little bit higher polyphenol content, very similar observation. So you start with a certain a zero level of haze. You add the yeast. It increases obviously, and the more hazy your beer will become. But then over time it settles to a value. In this case, it's 20 EBC after, in this case, 60 days. So in short, there's no impact of bottle re-fermentation on the final haze level in the beer. That's the take-home message here. So where to use Spring Blanche? Because it's important if you decide to use Spring Blanche in your process. Where do you put it? So if we look at the brewing process, we start with milling, mashing, boiling, and then whirlpool, fermentation, maturation to end up with the beer. So we looked at these conditions, added at fermentation, because when you start fermentation, you add yeast, so it would be easy to also add Spring Blanche in this case. So we looked at that, and we also looked at adding Spring Blanche at maturation, so after fermentation. So we added again at a concentration of 10 grams per hectoliter, and we did fermentation 11 plate a wort at 26 degrees for 13 days. We matured for 24 hours at 4 degrees, forced carbonate, and then we measured total polyphenol, which was in this case 131, and then we measured the haze stability at 20 degrees, so at room temperature for 6 months. So the important to mention is that this was a wit beer, Belgian style wit beer, so 67% malt and 33% unmalted wheat. So you already can expect some haze based on the malt bill. So this is the result. So on the x-axis you have the days, on the y-axis again you have the EBC units measured by the Huffman device, so the haziness level. So the first phase is fermentation, and then we add Spring Blanche, which is the orange line, and you see the haziness is going down and ends up very low. If you compare it to the control, with no addition, it's exactly the same. Then if you add Spring Blanche, you see it also drops very fast. You still have some remaining haze, but the best stable haze is actually when you add it in the maturation phase, because the difference between the addition at fermentation and the addition at maturation is shown here. So the difference between the orange line and the gray line, and you see a clear addition of haze level, in this case around 10 EBC units, because of the addition of Spring Blanche. So based on that, we concluded that you cannot add it during fermentation. Probably, the protein will stick to the yeast, and when the yeast settles, also the Spring Blanche will settle along with it. So it's better to do that after fermentation and in the maturation phase. Then you can create a stable haze. So final conclusion, I think I showed that Spring Blanche induces a stable haze in all kinds of beers. So I showed blonde beers, strong blonde beers, Belgian style wit beers and wheat beer. They all ended up with a nice hazy level, which was constant over time. We also saw that beers treated with proteases, in this case the Clarex, impact the haze stability. So you lose haze stability and you lose haziness actually if you add Clarex, which is kind of obvious because Clarex cuts proline-rich proteins, and Spring Blanche is a proline-rich protein. So it does not work. We also saw that yeast pitching rate at bottle re-fermentation does not affect haze stability. So if you decide to bottle re-ferment and want to create a hazy beer, it's possible. We saw in the last slide that spring blanch should be added at the maturation phase. And if you want to have more information about spring blanch, you can find it here, so the spec sheet, etc. So with that, I reached the end. Again, I want to indicate the Fermentis app with a lot of information. If you download it, you can see how it works. I don't know how many of you have already downloaded it, but it's a very useful tool. Also because it's on your phone, so you can use it anywhere in the brewery. It's quite handy. Next week, I will talk, as I mentioned, about kettle sour beers using Chef Sour LP652. And that's about it. If you have the time, please complete the questionnaire. I already had quite a lot of answers and suggestions and comments, and with these I will prepare new webinars in the future. So in early 2021 we will start up with new webinars. Questions, guys? Danny is typing. When do you pitch a spring blanch? What does the spring blanch doing with the phenols of dry hops in the New England? When you dry hop, the beer will interact with the polyphenols and create additional haze. And normally in your New England IPA, you already have quite a nice haze level. It's not always stable. But if you add spring blanch, you will get the interaction, as I showed here in the slides, with spring blanch and the polyphenols from the dry hop. So if you dry hop, it also works. Even if you remove it. So I had a question from a brewery, I think 2 months ago, who were dry hopping and wanted to add the spring blanch at the same time. And then they said, okay, we will remove the hops. Will we remove the spring blanch? But actually, it's the spring blanch is not removed because these protein polyphenol complexes are extremely small, smaller than 1 micrometer. So they stay dispersed in the beer. They will not settle because the particles are simply too small. So another question by Danny. If I understand it well, you can also create a gluten pour with beer with spring blanch. Well, if you want to create a gluten-free beer and use brewer's Clarex to remove the gluten, so the protein that is causing this gluten reaction for people that have gluten intolerance, it does not work because the gluten protein is very rich in proline, and Clarex will, if you add Klarex to produce gluten-free beer, will cut this this enzyme. That said, if you use a gluten-free mash, so for instance, if you use sorghum, which does not contain gluten, then it will work. But if as soon as you add a product like a brewer's Klarex to remove the gluten from beer, it will not work with Spring Blanche, because these proteins they look alike. They are both protein rich, so they will be cut, and then you end up with clear beer in the end. To be honest, I not a lot of brewers that produce gluten-free beers are actually starting from a gluten-free matrix. So starting from, for instance, sorghum. Most of the cases, they might use a little bit of sorghum, but they will always use also barley, just for the enzymatic power in barley malt. Which is very poor in cereals like sorghum. So the addition of this Klarex was actually found by accident. So Klarex has been developed for a completely different purpose in the past. It has been developed to basically stabilize the beer and make bright beer. But they found, on the side that it also removed the gluten proteins, so it could be used for gluten-free beers, and a lot of applications now are more towards gluten-free beers than to making bright beer. But that's just a side note. Okay, yeah, thanks, Danny. Well, if there are no other questions, I will end the webinar and hopefully see you next week to talk about sour beers. Very interesting and fast, popular, rising beer style.
Okay.
Thanks, Alar, and see you next week.
Will you send me also the link and banner for the next?
Yes, yes, I will. Bye, guys.
Bye.